Like, welcome, listeners. Find a comfortable place to settle in. Make sure your doors are locked, and perhaps double check the windows. Turn down the lights and let the shadows stretch across the room. Tonight, we are delving into 4 true accounts of sanctuary violated. We often believe that our homes are impenetrable fortresses, that the locks on our doors are an absolute barrier between us and the horrors of the outside world. But what happens when the threat doesn't just knock? What happens when it is already inside, waiting for you in the dark? These are true stories of intrusion, betrayal, and the terrifying moments when the illusion of safety shatters. Right, let's begin. Story 1. The intruder in the closet. Do you remember the first time you were left home alone at night? For most, it feels like a sudden, intoxicating rush of independence. The entire house is yours. No rules, no bedtime, no supervision. But that vast, empty space can quickly turn hostile when the sun goes down. Our first story takes us back 14 years. The narrator was just 12 years old, navigating that delicate age where you still fear the dark, but desperately want to prove you don't. His parents were heading out for the evening, leaving him in the care of his 18-year-old brother, Zach. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful weekend night, but Zach had other plans. Shortly after their parents' car disappeared down the street, Zach pulled his younger brother aside. He was leaving. He had friends to see, places to be, and he demanded absolute secrecy. The 12-year-old eagerly agreed. What? Why wouldn't he? He liked his brother, he understood the stakes, and most importantly, he was thrilled at the prospect of having the massive house completely to himself. The evening started exactly as a 12-year-old's fantasy should. He took command of the living room, settling into the den to watch a horror movie. But as the fictional terror played out on the glowing screen, the real-world isolation began to seep into his bones. A house, when empty, has a voice of its own. It settles. Right. The floorboards moan under the weight of unseen pressures. The refrigerator hums and clicks in the kitchen. The wind rattles the window panes like knuckles tapping against the glass. Halfway through the film, the boy was no longer enjoying his freedom. His nerves were frayed. Every jump scare on the television made him violently flinch, his eyes darting over his shoulder toward the dark, gaping mouth at the stairwell, half expecting a silhouette to be standing there in the gloom. He couldn't take the suspense anymore. He killed the television, plunging the lower floor into oppressive silence. Panic, sharp and sudden, seized him. He bolted up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs, fleeing from the invisible, nameless dread that chases every child up a dark staircase. Seeking refuge, he rushed into the adjoining bathroom, furiously scrubbing his teeth just to establish a sense of normalcy, before retreating into his bedroom. He powered on his Xbox 360, diving into a session of Call of Duty Zombies. The chaotic noise of the game, the chatter through his headset, it all acted as a digital shield against the creeping anxiety of the empty house. Hours dissolved. He was completely absorbed in the virtual survival. But eventually, his digital team was overrun, and frustration set in. He glanced at the time. It was incredibly late. The exhaustion was finally catching up to him, and he decided to power down the console and try to sleep. He lay in his bed, the room bathed in shadows. And then, he felt it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the floorboards. The heavy front door downstairs had been opened and clicked shut. Relief washed over him. Wait, Zach was home. The boy lay perfectly still, listening to the familiar sounds of someone moving around on the ground floor. But as the seconds ticked into minutes, the relief began to curdle into something else. Something cold. When Zach came home late, he always bypassed the living spaces and went straight upstairs to his room. But the footsteps downstairs weren't moving toward the stairs. They were meandering. Like, they were subtle, cautious shuffles, accompanied by strange, muffled thuds and the scraping of objects being moved. Like, the boy's stomach twisted into a knot. The residual dread from the horror movie flared back to life. He quietly slipped out of bed, creeping toward his bedroom window. He pulled the blind back just a fraction. Looking down at the driveway, he expected to see Zach's car parked under the glowing street lamp. The driveway was completely empty. A wave of pure, paralyzing terror crashed over him. He was 12. He didn't have a cell phone. There was no way to text his parents. The landline phones were scattered throughout the house, down the hall, in the kitchen, all miles away across enemy territory. He was completely cut off. Moving on pure instinct, he tiptoed to his bedroom door to check the lock. It was a flimsy interior lock, the kind that could be popped open from the hallway with a simple coin or a fingernail. It offered no real protection. If whoever was downstairs wanted to get in, they were going to get in. He scanned his room desperately, his eyes locked onto the small, built-in crawl closet set deep into the wall. It was the only option. He squeezed his small frame inside, pulling the door tightly shut behind him. The darkness in the closet was absolute. The air was stale, smelling of dust and old wood. He pulled his knees to his chest, trying to muffle the deafening sound of his own ragged breathing. He prayed to whatever was listening that he was just a paranoid child. He begged the universe to let it be Zach, maybe parking on the street to avoid waking the neighbors. Then, he heard the footsteps on the stairs. They were heavy and hurried. They moved down the hallway, stopping right outside his door. Click. The door rattled. Someone was fumbling with the flimsy lock. A second later, the mechanism gave way, and the bedroom door creaked open. The boy clamped his hands over his mouth, tears streaming silently down his face. Someone was standing inside his bedroom. The floorboards groaned under the massive weight of the intruder. The boy listened in agonizing silence as the stranger began tearing through his room. Drawers were pulled open and tossed aside. Items were unceremoniously shoved across the floor. The heavy, scraping sound of electronics being dragged across the carpet vibrated right through the closet wall. Every single second felt like an hour. The boy waited for the closet door to be violently ripped open. He imagined the blinding light, the face of the intruder looking down at him. He was convinced he was going to die in that tiny, suffocating space. He barely allowed himself to inhale, muscles cramping, completely frozen in a state of primal survival. After what felt like an eternity of ransacking, the heavy footsteps finally moved toward the bedroom door. They receded down the hallway. But the boy did not move. He couldn't. He stayed curled in the suffocating blackness of the closet for nearly 2 hours, terrified that it was a trick, terrified that the monster was simply waiting on the other side of the door for him to peek out. Finally, a voice shattered the silence. It was calling his name from the bottom of the stairs. It was urgent, loud, and incredibly angry. It was Zach. The boy slowly pushed the closet door open, blinking against the light of his bedroom. He stepped out just as his older brother stormed into the room. Zach took one look at the 12-year-old and exploded into furious yelling, demanding to know why the room was destroyed and what his little brother had been doing. The boy, violently shaking and unable to control the tremors in his hands, finally managed to choke out the truth. Someone had been inside. Zach's anger instantly evaporated, replaced by a pale, sickening realization. The brothers moved cautiously through the house together, taking inventory of the violation. It was catastrophic. Televisions were gone. Gaming consoles, ripped from their cords. Drawers in every room had been emptied. Valuables vanished into the night. Zach immediately dialed 911. The police arrived, taking notes, dusting for prints, and securing the compromised perimeter. But the true reckoning came out for them, mate. Late. 0 a.m. when their parents finally pulled into the driveway. The father bypassed the police entirely. He marched straight up to the 18-year-olds and struck him across the face, a furious, devastating blow fueled by the terrifying realization of what his negligence could have cost them. He had left a child alone, and worse, he had left the front door completely unlocked. Zach spent years paying off the stolen items, stripped of his freedom and his parents' trust. But for the 12-year-old boy, the toll was far heavier. Night. No stolen television could compare to the psychological scars left behind. To this day, as a grown man of 26, the memory of that suffocating dark closet, the heavy footsteps of a faceless predator moving just inches away, remains the most defining, terrifying moment of his life. Story 2. The neighbor David. In a small, idyllic community, safety is often assumed. Everyone knows everyone. You recognize the cars on the street, you know the faces at the grocery store, and you trust the people who live right next door. But a familiar face is the most dangerous disguise a monster can wear. Our second narrator was just a toddler, not even old enough for kindergarten. Following his parents' separation, he lived under the fiercely protective roof of his grandparents and his uncle. He was enveloped in love, constantly surrounded by family. And like all children, the golden rule was drilled into his head on a daily basis. Never, ever open the door for a stranger. One of the frequent fixtures in the boy's young life was a neighbor. For the sake of this story, we will call him David. David was a seemingly jovial, helpful presence. He was always around, drinking cheap beers with the boy's uncle on the porch, watching wrestling matches on their television, or helping the grandfather wrench on the engine of his old pickup truck. When the grandfather would return from a hunting trip in the dense woods, David was always the first one there, rolling up his sleeves to help haul the heavy game into the backyard shed. He was part of the fabric of their lives. It was a quiet evening. The boy's grandmother was at the local bingo hall, waiting for a ride. The grandfather grabbed his keys, telling the boy he would be back in 15 minutes, and issued the standard warning: do not answer the door for anyone you don't know. The boy nodded, entirely captivated by the cartoons flashing on the screen. The grandfather walked out, and the heavy thud of the front door closing left the house entirely silent. Scarcely a few minutes later, 3 sharp knocks echoed from the entryway. The child hopped off the couch and trotted to the door. "Who is it?" he called out through the wood. "It's David, buddy," the familiar voice replied from the porch. The boy hesitated. "Grandpa and Grandma aren't here," he announced innocently. "I know," David's voice came back, smooth and reassuring. "I saw your grandpa's truck leave. Is your uncle around?" "No," the boy answered. "I know that too," David said. "I was just talking to him on the phone. He's over at a buddy's house having some drinks. Let me in." The boy's mind worked through the rigid logic of a toddler. "Night. Never open the door for a stranger." "I can't," he said. "I'm not allowed to open the door for strangers." A soft chuckle drifted through the wood. "But I'm not a stranger, am I? I'm your neighbor. You know me. We watch TV together. Come on, open the door." The logic was flawless to a child's mind. David was a friend. He wasn't a stranger. The boy reached up on his tiptoes, unfastened the lock, and pulled the door open. David stepped over the threshold, and instantly, the atmosphere in the room turned toxic. The man towered over the tiny child. He was swaying heavily on his feet, reeking of stale alcohol. White, one of his eyes was squinted shut in a drunken, sloppy haze. He immediately reached down and clamped his large, heavy hands tightly onto the boy's small shoulders. The boy, accustomed to his own uncle's occasional drunkenness, wasn't immediately terrified. He took a step backward, trying to wriggle free. "You can wait in the kitchen," the boy suggested politely, pointing down the hall. "I want to watch my show." But David's grip tightened into a vice. The jovial, neighborly mask slipped off entirely, revealing something dark, vile, and predatory underneath. David's voice dropped to a hateful, aggressive snarl. The exact words he used to have been scrubbed from the narrator's memory by trauma, but the feeling of pure, unadulterated terror remains vivid. He violently dragged the small boy across the floor, hauling him into the kitchen. Still pinning the child, David reached onto the counter and grabbed a massive, heavy kitchen knife. The boy began to weep. David pushed the sharp tip of the blade directly against the soft flesh of the toddler's belly. "You want me to stab you?" David hissed, his breath hot and sour. The boy sobbed harder. "Shut up," the man threatened, his eyes wild. "Shut up, or he'll cut out your tongue. He'll slit your throat." To prove his point, David flipped the knife in his hand, pressing the cold, dull spine of the steel firmly across the boy's tiny windpipe, holding him hostage in his own kitchen. Just then, the crunch of gravel echoed from the driveway. Heavy truck doors slammed shut. A massive wave of relief washed over the boy. He opened his mouth to scream, but David brutally clamped a sweaty hand over the child's face, smothering the sound. He dragged the boy backward, pivoting toward the kitchen doorway, just as the front door swung open. The grandmother walked in first. The warm smile on her face instantly vanished. The blood drained from her cheeks as she processed the horrific tableau. Her neighbor, drunk and unhinged, holding a massive blade to her grandchild's throat. She let out a blood-curdling scream. The grandfather burst through the doorway behind her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. A primal, ferocious roar tore from his lungs as he lunged forward, charging the armed man with the sheer, blinding rage of a patriarch protecting his blood. David panicked. He violently shoved the toddler to the linoleum floor and braced for impact. The grandmother swooped in instantly, scooping the boy into her arms, burying his face into her chest so he couldn't see the violence unfolding, whispering frantically that he was safe. Behind her, the sounds of a brutal struggle echoed through the kitchen. Flesh hitting flesh, heavy boots scraping against the floor, grunts of exertion and fury. The grandfather, fueled by adrenaline, completely overpowered the younger, drunken man. When the boy finally dared to look, his grandfather had David by the collar, violently shoving him out the front door. He screamed at the man, promising death if he'd ever set foot near the property again, before slamming the heavy door so hard the walls shook. Years passed. The boy grew into a man, the terrifying memory of the knife at his throat fading into a dull scar of his childhood. It wasn't until his grandfather passed away that the final, chilling puzzle piece of that night fell into place. He was sitting with his grandmother after the funeral, reminiscing about the old man's bravery. He brought up that night, marveling at how his grandfather had saved him, and wondering aloud why they had never called the police to press charges against David. His grandmother's face grew remarkably pale. She looked away, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "Do you remember what your grandpa did later that night?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The narrator searched his memory. He recalled, vaguely, the sound of the truck starting up again long after the sun had gone down. "He went hunting, didn't he?" he replied, even though he never hunted at night. His grandmother didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, claiming her memory was fading. But the realization hit the grandson with the force of a freight train. They lived in a remote town. His grandfather was a highly respected man, friends with the local police, a devout churchgoer, and an expert hunter who knew the deep woods better than anyone's. David the neighbor was never seen again after that night. He simply vanished. If a respected local hunter was seen driving his truck out of town in the dead of night, with a heavy, bloody tarp strapped into the truck bed. In a town where everyone knew everyone, who would ever dare to ask him what he caught? Story 3. The Sleepover Friend. Our next account brings us into the volatile, unpredictable world of teenagers. It is a story about the devastating consequences of ignored instincts, and how quickly a familiar face can become a vessel for absolute madness. It was the spring break of 2020. The world was already on edge, but for a 15-year-old boy left home alone while his parents traveled, the only concern was how to pass the time. He was lounging in his bedroom when his phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed the name Mason. White. This was unusual. Mason was a peripheral friend from school, an acquaintance rather than a confidant. They rarely texted, let alone called. The boy picked up. Before he could even offer a greeting, Mason's voice spilled frantically through the speaker. He sounded breathless, erratic, and deeply desperate. He asked what the narrator was doing, and when he learned the house was empty, Mason begged to drop off another mutual friend, Neil. Neil needed a place to crash for the night. Immediately, the narrator hesitated. He had known Neil since the 3rd grade. Neil had always been eccentric, loud, and utterly unfiltered. But recently rumors had been circulating the high school hallways. Friends whispered that Neil was acting bizarrely in class, bursting into sudden, hysterical laughter in dead silent rooms, clapping at nothing, and cornering classmates to ramble about how the high school basketball coaches were actually Freemasons plotting to convert him. The narrator told Mason no. He wanted to be alone. But Mason pleaded. His voice cracked with genuine desperation. Finally, playing to the vices of a 15-year-old, Mason offered a bribe. If he could just dump Neil at the house, he would let the narrator use his weed pen. Against his better judgment, the narrator caved. Fine, he sighed. Bring him over. It was a decision that nearly cost him his life. Minutes later, a car pulled into the driveway. The narrator walked to the front door to greet them. He took the promised hit from the weed pen, handing it back to Mason. But as Mason prepared to leave, the atmosphere shifted violently. Mason grabbed Neil by both shoulders. His knuckles were white. Tears were brimming in Mason's eyes, threatening to spill over. Please, man, Mason choked out, staring intensely into Neil's eyes. Please don't do that thing. Neil stared back. His expression was a terrifying, hollow blankness. I understand, he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. Mason unpractically sprinted back to his car, peeling out of the driveway without another word. The narrator, thoroughly creeped out, but too stoned to process the severity of the red flags, stepped aside and let Neil into the house. He shut the heavy front door. Neil didn't move. He stood rigidly in the entryway. Without looking at his friend, he asked, "Are all the doors locked?" The alarm bells in the narrator's head finally began to ring. Yeah, he answered cautiously. White. Show me, Neil demanded. A cold sweat broke out on the back of the narrator's neck. He slowly led Neil down the narrow hallway, pointing out the deadbolt on the back patio door, and verifying the lock on the laundry room exit. Neil examined the locks. He said nothing. The silence in the house was suffocating. White, then completely unprompted, Neil's right arm shot straight up into the air, perfectly rigid, as if he were raising his hand in a classroom. He slowly turned his head to look at the narrator, and his face stretched into a wide, unnatural, tooth-bearing grin. He held that horrific expression, arm raised to the ceiling, for 5 agonizing seconds, staring right through his childhood friend. The narrator, terrified, forced out a nervous chuckle to try and break the tension. Neil slowly lowered his arm. The smile vanished instantly. I want water, Neil stated. They walked into the kitchen. The narrator opened the refrigerator, pulling out a plastic bottle. When he turned back around, his heart stopped. Neil was standing flush against the kitchen counters. He was slowly, silently pulling open the heavy wooden drawer that held the silverware. His fingers were hovering directly over a large, serrated steak knife. Survival instinct took over. The narrator lunged across the kitchen, grabbing Neil's wrist before he could touch the steel, and violently slammed the drawer shut, Neil didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just slowly turned his head, looked the narrator dead in the eyes, and let out a soft, chilling chuckle, as if the attempted arming was just a hilarious prank. But the fear was absolute. The narrator felt the blood pounding in his ears. He was trapped in an empty house with an unpredictable, volatile entity wearing his friend's face. He needed to get him out. Masking his terror, the narrator casually suggested they go for a walk to the neighborhood park. Neil agreed, his demeanor snapping back to a terrifyingly calm baseline. They walked to the laundry room that led to the driveway. As the narrator opened the exterior door, he stepped aside, gesturing for Neil to exit first. As soon as Neil's foot hit the concrete outside, the narrator said, "Hold on, let me grab my shoes." Neil stopped and turned back, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features. "Hurry up," he snapped. The narrator slammed the heavy metal door, instantly throwing the deadbolt. He backed away, his chest heaving, pulling his phone from his pocket and frantically dialing his older brother. He babbled out the situation, begging him to come immediately. While he waited, his stoned, paranoid mind raced. He sprinted back into the kitchen, opened the silverware drawer, and gathered every single knife, carrying the metallic bundle upstairs to hide in his bedroom, terrified that Neil was going to smash a window to get back inside. Less than 5 minutes later, the brother arrived with 3 of his own friends. The narrator cautiously unlocked the door and stepped outside. Neil was standing in the driveway, completely unbothered by being locked out. He was surrounded by the older boys, furiously rambling. He was spinning a psychotic, breathless narrative about the Illuminati, claiming the high school basketball coaches were sexually assaulting the teen to extract their energy. The older boys, disturbed but authoritative, demanded Neil get in their car. They were taking him home. Neil resisted, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying paranoia. "I can't go home," he shrieked. My dad is going to kill me." Eventually, they forced him into the vehicle and drove away, leaving the narrator standing on his lawn, trembling in the cool night air. He immediately called Mason back, demanding to know what the hell was wrong with Neil, and why he had been dumped there. Mason, sounding broken and exhausted, confessed the terrifying truth. During their car ride over, Neil had pulled out a notebook. He began reading aloud from a handwritten manifesto. The pages detailed his absolute conviction that his father was plotting to murder him. To prevent it, Neil's manifesto concluded that he had only 2 options. He had to commit suicide, or he had to kill someone else first. Mason, trapped in a moving vehicle with a homicidal friend, had panicked. He drove to the first house he could think of, dumped the threat, and fled. It was later revealed that Neil had experimented with a severe cocktail of hallucinogenic drugs, triggering a dormant schizophrenic break. He was hearing voices commanding him to act. The narrator survived that night purely because he paid attention. Had he been looking at his phone, or staring out the window for just 5 seconds longer in that kitchen, he would never have seen the hand reaching for the knife, and he would never have lived to tell the story. Story 4. The Shadow in the Window. Our final story proves that the sanctity of daylight offers no protection against those who wish to do us harm. We associate home invasions with the dead of night, with shattered glass and kicked-in doors. We never expect the predator to simply walk in while the sun is shining. The narrator was just 10 years old. It was a brilliant, warm, sun-drenched afternoon. His mother was preparing for a grocery run and urged her son to tag along. But like any 10-year-old boy faced with the prospect of navigating boring supermarket aisles, he vehemently protested. He argued, he winned, and he promised he would stay out of trouble. He just wanted to shoot hoops in the driveway. Exhausted by the argument, his mother finally relented. She told him she would only be gone for 2 hours, kissed his forehead, and backed her car out of the driveway. As soon as the car disappeared around the corner, the boy was in his element. He dragged a weathered basketball from the garage and spent the next hour lost in his own imagination. He was playing the finals in his head, counting down the buzzer, pivoting, and shooting in the warm afternoon heat. Eventually, the exertion caught up with him. Sweating and breathless, he let the ball bounce lazily against the hot asphalt as he bent over to catch his breath. He casually glanced up toward the massive, two-story house. His eyes drifted to the second-floor window. It was his older sister's bedroom. The blinds were partially drawn, casting harsh, slatted shadows across the glass. But behind the glass, standing perfectly still, was a silhouette. The boy froze. He blinked, assuming the glare of the sun was playing tricks on his eyes. But as he stared, the dark shape shifted, adjusting its weight. It was a person, a tall, broad figure standing in the shadows of the empty room, looking directly down at him in the driveway. The boy's blood ran cold. The basketball slipped from his trembling hands, rolling away into the street. His mind raced through the inventory of his family. His sister was miles away at college. His father was at the office. His mother was across town at the supermarket. The house was supposed to be completely empty. Driven by the naive, foolish bravery of a child, the boy didn't run to a neighbor. He ran toward the danger. He sprinted around the side of the house, unlatching the heavy wooden gate, and burst through the back patio or into the kitchen. He slammed the door behind him. The house was suffocating like Wyatt. "Who's home?" The boy screamed up the staircase. His voice cracked, betraying his absolute terror. For a terrifying 3 seconds, there was only silence. Then, a voice drifted down from the second-floor landing. "Bright. Light. Come upstairs." The boy stopped breathing. It wasn't his father. It wasn't his mother. The voice was deep, incredibly calm, and completely unfamiliar. It wasn't a monstrous growl. It was the chilling, controlled tone of a stranger trying to sound perfectly normal, trying to coax a child up into the shadows. The boy didn't hesitate. He spun around, grabbed the cordless phone off the kitchen counter, and sprinted back out the door, flying across the lawn until he reached the edge of the street. He dialed his mother's number, sobbing hysterically into the receiver. When she answered, annoyed by the interruption, he screamed that a man was inside the house. He told her the man knew his name. He begged her to come back. The raw, unfiltered terror in her son's voice shattered her skepticism. She dropped her groceries, sprinted to her car, and dialed 911 while she sped home. She pulled into the driveway at the exact moment a police cruiser arrived with sirens blaring. The boy pointed a shaking finger at the second-story window. The officers drew their weapons and breached the house. His mother followed minutes later. The 10-year-old boy remained rooted to the concrete outside, staring up at the glass, terrified the face would reappear. 10 minutes later, the police emerged. They holstered their weapons, shaking their heads. They had torn the house apart. They checked the closets, beneath the beds, behind the heavy dressers, and even swept the dark, dusty expanse of the attic. They found absolutely nothing. The house was empty. With the threat seemingly neutralized, the boy's mother grew stern. The relief gave way to anger. She accused him of letting his imagination run wild, threatening punishment for wasting the police's time with ghost stories. The boy pleaded, swore he was telling the truth, but his words fell on deaf ears. Night eventually fell. The boy lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying that deep, calm voice over and over again. Exhaustion finally dragged him down into a fitful, uneasy sleep. He didn't know what time it was when his eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black, illuminated only by the faint, ambient glow of the moonlight, bleeding through his window. But the house was dead silent. But something had woken him. A sound, a shift in the air. He slowly sat up, clutching his blanket to his chest. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, tracing the familiar outlines of his furniture. His desk, his closet door, cracked open. And then, his gaze shifted to the foot of his bed. Standing there, completely motionless in the dark, was a towering, broad-shouldered shadow. The boy's brain misfired. He thought it was a nightmare. But then, the shadow inhaled. The silhouette shifted. It was a full-grown man, standing in his bedroom watching him sleep. A primal, ear-piercing scream ripped from the boy's throat. The sound shattered the silence of the house. Instantly, the figure exploded into motion. The intruder didn't lunge for the boy. He took to massive, sweeping strides across the bedroom, grabbed the window sash, and violently heaved it open. Without hesitation, the man hurled his body out the second-story window, crashing onto the sloping roof of the awning below. The boy's parents burst through the bedroom door, flipping on the light, finding their son hysterical, pointing at the open window where the cold night air was rushing in. His father sprinted to the window, catching a glimpse of the dark figure dropping from the awning into the backyard. Driven by paternal fury, the father bolted downstairs and out the back door, running barefoot into the dark grass, hunting the intruder. But he was too late. The man had vanished into the labyrinth of the neighborhood fences. Wait. The police returned. Wait. More reports were filed. What? More perimeters were searched. But the horrifying reality of the situation could not be ignored. The police hadn't missed the man during their afternoon sweep. He wasn't hiding in a closet. The intruder had either found a miraculous, invisible hiding spot, or far more terrifyingly, he had slipped out the window before the cops arrived, climbed up onto the roof, and waited. He waited while the police searched. He waited while the mother scolded her son. And he waited patiently in the freezing dark for night to fall, so he could quietly climb back through the boy's window while the family slept. He was inside the house all day. He knew the boy's name. He stood at the foot of his bed in the pitch black. And the question that still haunts the narrator to this day is this: how long was the man standing there in the dark, watching him sleep, before he woke up? Thank you for joining us in the dark tonight. Listeners, keep your wits about you, and never ignore that small voice inside your head telling you something is wrong. Would you like to explore more tales of narrow escapes, or should we venture into stories of unresolved, chilling disappearances next time? Sleep well. If you can, welcome, listeners. Find a comfortable spot, settle in, and perhaps double-check the locks on your doors. There is a profound, unspoken trust we place in hotels. When you are traveling, exhausted and miles away from the sanctuary of your own home, a hotel room offers a temporary oasis. You pay for a bed, a shower, and most importantly, you pay for a locked door. You swipe a plastic keycard, hear the heavy mechanical click of the deadbolt, and you believe, implicitly, that the space belongs entirely to you. You strip off your clothes, you close your eyes, and you surrender to sleep, trusting that the thin wooden barrier separating you from a hallway of strangers will hold. But what happens when that trust is violated? What happens when the lock fails, or worse, when the threat doesn't need to break in, because it is already waiting for you in the dark? Tonight, we delve into for harrowing true accounts from the road, for stories of individuals who learned the terrifying reality that a hotel room is, at its core, a room where thousands of strangers have slept before. And sometimes, those strangers don't leave. This is the dark side of hospitality. Our first story takes us to the desolate, winding highways of Pennsylvania. For many of us who travel for work, the routine becomes a blur. Highway markers, rest stops, and cheap motels all bleed into one long, continuous gray line. Our narrator was a veteran of this lifestyle. He wasn't looking for luxury. He just needed a horizontal surface and a hot shower. He had stayed in countless budget motels across the country, entirely untouched by danger or paranoia. He considered himself a pragmatist, but pragmatism offers no protection against the unexplainable. It was late when he finally pulled into a small, unremarkable city in Pennsylvania. He checked into a generic, aging hotel. The kind of place time forgot. The lobby was suffocatingly small, carpeted in a depressing, faded crimson that seemed to swallow the dim overhead light. The air hung heavy with a distinct, musty odor, a scent of ancient dust and stale floral perfume that instantly reminded him of a neglected grandmother's house. The woman working the front desk was silent and unsmiling. She wordlessly slid a physical metal key across the counter. He took it, riding the groaning elevator up to the third floor. Stepping out, the hallway greeted him with an oppressive, unnatural quiet. It didn't just feel empty. It felt abandoned. The air was stagnant. He found his room, turned the heavy key, and pushed the door open. It was exactly what he paid for. A small, stiff bed, a scuffed wooden desk, and a cramped bathroom. Dropping his heavy duffel bag onto the mattress, he flipped on the television to drown out the suffocating silence of the corridor, hoping the mindless chatter of a late-night broadcast would ground him. Exhaustion was a heavy weight on his shoulders. He took a quick, scalding shower, watched the glowing screen until his eyes grew heavy, and finally switched off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Sleep claimed him quickly. But the sanctuary of sleep did not last. Sometime in the dead, quiet hours of the middle of the night, he was pulled from his rest by a sound. S-C-R-I-I-I-H. It was faint, a soft, continuous sliding noise grazing against the thin carpet. In his groggy, half-conscious state, his brain tried to rationalize it. It was just the ice machine down the hall. It was the vac unit kicking into gear. He rolled over, pulling the heavy comforter up to his chin, desperate to fall back into the void. Light. Then it happened again. S-C-R-I-I-H. This time, there was no mistaking the location of the sound. It wasn't down the hall. It was directly inside his room, right at the base of the heavy wooden door leading to the corridor. His eyes snapped open. The exhaustion evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He blindly reached for the nightstand, his fingers fumbling until he found the switch for the bedside lamp. Yellow light flooded the small space. He stared at the base of the door. Protruding just an inch from underneath the wooden frame, resting on the carpet, was a small, white rectangle. Someone had slid a piece of paper under his door. He held his breath, straining to hear the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. But there was nothing. The corridor beyond the door was as silent as a tomb. Whoever had placed it there was either moving with impossible stealth, or they were still standing right on the other side of the wood. Slowly, his bare feet touching the cold floor, he crept toward the entryway. He bent down and picked up the paper. It was folded in half. His hands were visibly shaking as he opened it. Scrawled across the cheap paper in messy, jagged, incredibly uneven handwriting were just a few words. I am watching you from somewhere inside the hotel. The narrator's heart slammed against his ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt impossibly thin. Who could have written this? White. He stood paralyzed in the center of the room, clutching the note, his eyes darting frantically between the locked door and the drawn curtains. He made a split-second decision. He was not opening that door. He lunged forward, sliding the heavy metal chain lock into its groove with a sharp clack. He retreated to the bed, pushing his back firmly against the headboard, pulling his knees to his chest. He left the lamp burning bright. Sleep was now a completely foreign concept. He sat there, eyes wide, listening to the deafening silence of the room. 20 agonizing minutes crawled by. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every creak of the building's foundation made him flinch. And then his blood ran completely cold. SCRI. He watched, horrified, as a second small piece of paper emerged from the dark crack beneath the door. It moved agonizingly slowly, as if the person on the other side was gently, playfully pushing it through with a single fingertip. He didn't want to read it. He knew he shouldn't read it. What? But the morbid, terrified curiosity dragged him off the bed. He approached the door, snatching the paper from the carpet. The handwriting on this second note was even worse. It was shaky, erratic, the letters violently pressing into the page. I was inside your room earlier today, before you arrived. I like watching people sleep here. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror crashed over his chest. The implication was too massive to process. Someone had been in his space. They had stood where he was standing. They had waited for him. He frantically spun around, his eyes sweeping the small confines of the room. He knew he was alone. He knew the room was empty. But logic has no place when fear takes the wheel. He dropped to his knees, throwing the bed skirt up to check the dusty shadows beneath the frame. Nothing. He ripped the closet door open. Empty. He marched into the bathroom, tearing the shower curtain back so violently the plastic rings snapped. Nothing. He retreated back to the mattress. It was past 2. Like, 0 a.m. Who do you call? The front desk. But what if the person slipping the notes was the person at the front desk? The shaky handwriting felt personal, unstable, like someone suffering from a severe delusion. He tried to convince himself it was a sick, twisted prank pulled by bored teenagers, but the isolation of the third floor made that impossible to believe. He sat rigid for another 30 minutes. His senses were dialed up to absolute maximum. The soft tap of the plumbing behind the drywall made him jump. The click of the air conditioning turning off sounded like a gunshot. He made a pact with himself. If a third note appeared, he was leaving. He would grab his keys, abandon his bag, and run. The silence stretched on so long that his racing heart began, ever so slightly, to slow its rhythm. The rational part of his brain started whispering that it was over. The prankster had gotten bored and moved on. And then, the sound returned. SCRI. It was slower this time. Deliberate. Tortuous. The paper scraped against the carpet fibers, sliding into the yellow light of the room. He didn't hesitate. He marched to the door, snatched the note, and unfolded it. The words on the page stopped his heart. I am already inside the room with you. He stopped breathing. Light. The air trapped in his lungs burned. He stared at the jagged ink, the horrifying reality of the sentence washing over him. He slowly lowered the paper, his eyes wide, turning in a slow, agonizing circle. He looked at the shadows pooling in the corners. He looked at the heavy, dark curtains. He didn't search the room again. He couldn't. The suffocating tightness in his chest demanded immediate action. He grabbed his duffel bag, throwing the strap over his shoulder. He stepped up to the door and pressed his eye against the small glass peephole. The doorway was completely, entirely empty. With trembling, frantic fingers, he unlatched the chain lock, turned the deadbolt, and dripped the door open. He bolted into the corridor, pulling the heavy door shut behind him with a deafening slam. He sprinted down the hallway, the faded red carpet muffling his frantic footsteps. He didn't wait for the slow elevator. He aimed straight for the illuminated exit sign of the stairwell. Just as his hand hit the cold metal of the stairwell door, he made the mistake of looking back. At the far end of the long, dim hallway, right near the very last room, a dark shape shifted. It was just a shadow, slipping silently around the corner, retreating out of sight. Someone had been standing there. What? He practically threw himself down the 3 flights of concrete stairs, bursting into the small lobby. Light. The woman from earlier was gone. A young man was behind the desk, blinking sleepily at a computer monitor. The narrator, breathless and pale, slammed his key onto the counter and poured out the story. Light. The threats. White. The employee looked completely bewildered. He checked his computer, shaking his head. Sir, there are only 3 other guests booked on the 3rd floor tonight. None of them have left their rooms. No one has been walking around. The clerk offered a different room, but the narrator refused. He demanded to check out immediately. But before he walked out into the cold night, he needed validation. He needed to know he wasn't losing his mind. He asked the clerk to accompany him back to the room, to check the windows, to look for any sign of a breach. The clerk, clearly nervous, grabbed a master key, and they rode the elevator back up together. They entered the room. It was exactly as the narrator had left it. The bed was unmade, the lamp was glowing, and the 3 notes lay scattered on the desk. The clerk walked over to the large window overlooking the parking lot. He pulled the heavy curtains back. He froze. He turned back to the narrator, his face completely drained of color. The metal latch on the window was completely broken. It had been recently, violently snapped off. The window wasn't locked. In fact, it was resting slightly open, just a fraction of an inch, allowing the cold night air to bleed into the room. Someone broke this, the clerk stammered. Someone from outside. The narrator didn't wait to hear another word. He turned on his heel, walked out of the room, and drove 20 minutes down the highway to a completely different hotel, sitting awake in a brightly lit lobby until the sun came up. The next morning, he called the original hotel to demand answers. Management was entirely dismissive. They claimed they reviewed the security footage and saw absolutely nothing. No one was in the hallway. No other guests complained. They treated him like a paranoid traveler who had a bad dream. But he knew they were lying. The broken window latch was real. And the most terrifying thought of all, the thought that keeps him awake on quiet nights, is the 3rd note. I am already inside the room with you. If the hallway was empty, and the window was broken, but where had the person been hiding when he searched the room? And how long had they been watching him sleep? Our second descent into darkness takes us further down the coast, to the humid, lonely stretches of Virginia. Have you ever driven so far past your limits that your vision begins to blur? The narrator of our next story was experiencing exactly that. He was on a grueling, multi-state drive to visit family. By midnight, his body had simply given up. The highway lines were hypnotizing him, and he knew that if he didn't pull over, he would drift off the road. He spotted a towering, illuminated sign for a budget hotel off the next exit. It was basic, utilitarian, and entirely unremarkable. As he pulled into the massive parking lot, he noticed it was almost entirely empty. Only a handful of cars were scattered under the flickering amber street lighted. The vast majority of the building's windows were completely dark. He grabbed his overnight bag and trudged into the lobby. The man behind the front desk looked like a ghost, pale, silent, barely lifting his eyes from whatever he was reading beneath the counter. The transaction was completely wordless. A keycode was programmed, slid across the laminate surface, and the narrator was directed to the 3rd floor. The elevator groaned as it ascended. When the doors parted, the narrator stepped into a dimly lit corridor. The overhead fluorescent tubes buzzed with a low, dying hum. As he walked down the long hall to his room at the very end, he noticed something incredibly unsettling. Almost every single door he passed had a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging from the handle. It felt unnatural. A completely empty parking lot, a dark building, yet an entire floor of guests demanding absolute isolation. It was the kind of hotel people use when they need to disappear for a night. He finally reached his room at the end of the hall. He swiped his card and pushed the door open. At first glance, it was a standard room, but as he stepped inside, a subtle, creeping sense of wrongness washed over him. The room felt like disturbed. It was messy, but not in an obvious way. The shade on the bedside lamp was tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle. One of the heavy wooden drawers on the dresser was pulled open just an inch. And on the perfectly made bed, right near the corner, the thick comforter was wrinkled and pressed down, exactly as if a heavy body had recently been sitting there. He stood in the doorway, analyzing the scene. It looked as though housekeeping had either been incredibly rushed, or someone had simply been hanging out in the room moments before he arrived. He remembered the dead-eyed clerk downstairs. The man hadn't mentioned anything about housekeeping delays. He shook his head, blaming his paranoia on absolute exhaustion. He threw his bag onto a nearby chair, turned on the television for some background noise, and crawled under the heavy blankets. He just needed sleep. He drifted off quickly, his body demanding the rest. But the peace was shattered. He didn't know how much time had passed, but a sound cut through the low murmur of the television. It was a mechanical click. His eyes opened in the dark. He lay perfectly still, listening. The heavy brass handle on his hotel room door was slowly, methodically turning downward. It was a faint, cautious movement. It wasn't the sound of someone drunkenly stumbling into the wrong room. It was calculated. Someone was silently testing the lock to see if the deadbolt was engaged. The narrator's breath hitched in his throat. He stared at the door. The room was bathed in the flickering, pale blue light of the muted television. He could clearly see the shadow of the lever handle depressed all the way to the bottom. The handle slowly released, returning to its horizontal position. Wait. The narrator waited. He expected to hear footsteps walking away. He expected a knock. He got neither. Instead, a new sound began. It was a sharp, metallic scratching. Metal grinding against metal. Someone was sliding a physical key into the lock on his door. Panic seized him. The only people who possessed master keys were the hotel staff. Why would a staff member be trying to silently enter his occupied room in the dead of night? He heard the heavy clunk of the deadbolt disengaging. The door pushed inward. A thin, blinding sliver of yellow hallway light sliced into the dark room. The door hovered there, open just a crack. The narrator lay frozen in the bed, his muscles locked in pure terror. He waited for a face to appear in the gap. He waited for a voice. Nothing. The sliver of light remained static for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, ever so gently, the door was pulled shut. The latch clicked. The narrator lay awake for an hour, his eyes burning, staring at the closed door. He listened for any sound in the hallway, but it remained silent. Eventually, his exhausted, desperate brain began to weave rationalizations. It was a security guard doing rounds. It was a confused maintenance worker. They realized their mistake and left. Too tired to move, too tired to even get out of bed and engage the chain lock. The heavy weight of sleep finally dragged him back under. It was a mistake that nearly cost him everything. At you. 0 a.m. His eyes snapped open again. This time, there was no sound at the door. The sound was already inside the room. It was a soft, frantic rustling, the distinct sound of heavy nylon fabric being unzipped in hands rooting through personal belongings. Someone was inside his room. The narrator was paralyzed by fear. He was terrified to move, terrified to breathe, but the instinct to survive forced him to turn his head. In the dark corner of the room, illuminated only by the faint ambient light slipping through the curtains, was a massive, towering silhouette. The figure was hunched over the chair where the narrator had left his overnight bag gagged. A surge of adrenaline propelled him upright in the bed. "Who is that?" he yelled, his voice shaking violently, cracking with panic. The rustling instantly stopped. The massive figure slowly stood up, turning to face the bed. In the shadows, the narrator could see that the lower half of the man's face was completely concealed by a thick, black mask. The intruder didn't run. He didn't panic. He simply looked at the narrator and spoke in a deep, gravelly, terrifyingly calm voice. "It's housekeeping," the man rumbled. "Sorry, I'll leave now." The narrator couldn't speak. He couldn't process the absurdity of the lie. He just watched, completely frozen, as the masked giant casually stepped away from the bag, walked to the front door, opened it, and disappeared into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. The second the latch clicked, the paralysis broke. Like the narrator leapt out of bed, practically throwing himself against the door to engage the heavy metal chain and flip the deadbolt. He hit the light switch, flooding the room with blinding light. He rushed to his bag. It was completely ravaged. Clothes were thrown everywhere, zippers ripped open. Wait. The man had been systematically going through his life while he slept just a few feet away. Trembling uncontrollably, he grabbed the room phone and dialed the front desk. When the clerk answered, the narrator screamed that someone had just used a key to break into his room. The clerk's response chilled him to the bone. "Sir, there is no housekeeping staff on duty at this hour. You are the only person on that floor." The narrator didn't wait. He threw his belongings into his bag in a chaotic frenzy, unlatched the door, and sprinted down the hallway to the lobby. He demanded the clerk call the police immediately. He demanded to see the security footage. When the local police finally arrived, the hesitant desk clerk brought up the digital surveillance logs for the third floors. The footage was a nightmare captured in stark black and white. It showed a massive, muscular man wearing dark clothing and a black mask over his face. The man did not work for the hotel, but the footage showed him methodically walking down the corridor, moving with the terrifying confidence of a predator. He was pacing back and forth, repeatedly stopping in front of the narrator's door, listening. Wait. And then, the footage showed the man pulling a master key from his pocket, sliding it into the lock, and letting himself into the dark room. The clerk, sweating and stammering, claimed the man must have stolen a master key from a housekeeping cart days ago. But the damage was done. The narrator demanded a full refund, threw his bag into his car, and drove into the night, eventually pulling into a brightly lit gas station to sleep in the locked, cramped confines of the driver's seat. He never pressed charges. He just wanted to forget. But the deep, calm voice of the masked giant standing in the dark corner of his room still echoes in his mind every time he closes his eyes. Our third story takes us to the eerie, silent corridors of a New Jersey motel. Working night shifts changes a person. You become accustomed to the quiet. You learn to navigate the world when everyone else is asleep. So, when our narrator, a night shift delivery driver, took a solitary weekend trip to hike a local New Jersey trail, the isolation of his cheap hotel didn't immediately bother him. He checked in as the sun was setting. The lobby carried that familiar, inescapable scent of stale air and old carpet. The woman behind the desk was polite but brief. She handed him his keycard and casually mentioned a detail that would later become a cornerstone of his terror. Housekeeping has already cleaned all the rooms for the night. You won't be disturbed. He took his key and headed to the second floor. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently as he walked down the hall, casting strobing, chaotic shadows against the peeling wallpaper. He ignored the oppressive atmosphere. He was simply too tired to care. He entered his room. It was small, incredibly cold, but seemingly clean. The sheets were pulled tight across the mattress. However, on a small sitting chair in the corner, a decorative pillow was sitting at a strange, crooked angle, looking as though it had just been tossed there. He obsessively straightened it, grabbed his toiletries, and headed for the bathroom to wash the travel off his skin. When he emerged from the scalding shower, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The bathroom mirror was completely fogged over, normal enough, but the temperature in the main bedroom had plummeted. It was a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to sink directly into his bones. He climbed into the bed, pulling the thin blankets tight. From his vantage point on the mattress, he had a clear view of a deep, dark alcove in the corner of the room, right next to a small, open closet. As he lay there waiting for sleep, his eyes kept darting to that dark corner. It was a primal, evolutionary reflex. The hairs on his arms stood up. His brain was screaming at him that the corner was not empty. Felt as though a heavy, oppressive gaze was bearing down on him from the shadows. He stared into the blackness, trying to force his eyes to adjust, but saw nothing. Exhaustion eventually won the battle, and he slipped into a heavy sleep. He woke up abruptly sometime after midnight. The room was bathed in the pale, sickly orange glow of the parking lot lights bleeding through the thin curtains. The silence was absolute. And then, he heard it. A soft, deliberate noise coming from the corner of the room. It sounded like heavy fabric sliding slowly across the carpet. He lay completely paralyzed, his eyes wide open, straining to see into the dark alcove. Then came the breathing. It was a wet, ragged, incredibly heavy sound. It wasn't the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning unit on the opposite wall. It was human. Someone was standing in the shadows of the open closet, trying desperately to take quiet breaths, but failing. Bite. The air rattled in their lungs. But the narrator's mind raced. He was trapped in the bed. He knew he had to look. He slowly, agonizingly pushed himself up onto his elbows, his eyes locked on the dark corner. His stomach dropped into a bottomless pit of dread. The closet door, which he explicitly remembered leaving wide open when he went to sleep, was now pulled partially shut. The gap was just wide enough for someone to stand behind the wooden peer out into the room. The exact second the narrator sat up in bed, the heavy breathing abruptly stopped. Whoever was in the closet knew he was awake. They were holding their breath. A surge of pure, unadulterated terror flooded his veins. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for a weapon. He slowly swung his legs over the side of the bed, never taking his eyes off the cracked closet door. He walked backward, step by agonizing step, toward the front door of the hotel room. He reached behind his back, his fingers fumbling blindly until they found the cold metal of the doorknob. He twisted it, threw the door open, and practically fell backward into the flickering light of the hallway. He didn't stop running until he hit the lobby. It was deserted. The phone behind the front desk was ringing loudly, echoing off the cheap tile, but no one was there to answer it. He stood shivering in the lobby for what felt like an eternity, terrified that the heavy-breathing entity from the closet was walking down the stairs behind him. Finally, the front desk clerk emerged from a back office, looking incredibly annoyed. The narrator, speaking in breathless, panicked sentences, explained that someone was hiding in his closet. The clerk looked at him like he was insane. "Sir," she said flatly, "housekeeping left hours ago. I am the only person here, and I have the only master keys. Night. No one is in your room." Despite her absolute dismissal, he demanded she check the room. Sighing heavily, she grabbed her keys and escorted him back to the second floor. They pushed the door open, hitting the lights. The room was entirely pristine. The closet door was wide open. The dark corner was empty. The pillow on the chair was perfectly straight. There was absolutely no trace of an intruder. The clerk offered a condescending smile, suggesting he was simply having a vivid night terror. Deeply offended but too terrified to argue, he refused to stay in that room. He demanded a new key. She rolled her eyes, handed him a keycard for a room at the opposite end of the long hallway, and took the elevator back down. He entered the new room, locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain, and dragged the heavy desk chair under the knob for good measure. He collapsed onto the new bed, but sleep was an impossibility. It was like 0 a.m. He lay in the dark, his ears straining for any sound. An hour later, the silence broke. From the far end of the hallway, a sound echoed through the wood of his door. It was the high-pitched, rhythmic squeak of heavy, ungraced wheels rolling slowly across the carpet. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy housekeeping cart being pushed down the corridor. The narrator sat bolt upright in bed. The clerk had explicitly told him, twice, that housekeeping was completely gone for the night. The squeaking grew louder, closer. It stopped directly outside his door. He held his breath, his eyes glued to the locked entryway. From the other side of the thin wooden door, he heard the breathing. It was the exact same heavy, wet, ragged breathing he had heard in the dark corner of his first room. Whoever had been in his closet had found him. They were standing mere inches away, separated only by a slab of cheap wood. The breathing continued for a full, agonizing minute. Light. Then, a sound that made his soul leave his body. A gentle, flat pressure was applied to the door. It wasn't a knock with knuckles. It sounded like someone slowly, sensually pressing the flat palm of their hand against the wood, sliding it down the surface, feeling the barrier between them. The narrator was trapped. His phone was on the desk across the room, and he was too utterly petrified to take a single step. He simply sat on the bed, trembling violently, waiting for the door to splinter open. But the lock held. Eventually, the breathing faded. The heavy cart squeaked back to life, slowly rolling away down the corridor until the hallway was silent once again. He didn't move for the rest of the night. He sat rigid in the bed, watching the door until the bright light of dawn finally broke through the curtains. He packed his bags and bolted downstairs to check out. The woman from the night shift was gone. A young man was now working the desk. The narrator, exhausted and traumatized, recounted the horrors of the night, the breathing in the closet, the phantom housekeeping cart. The young man listened, his expression growing incredibly dark. "Sir," the man said softly, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know why my coworker told you housekeeping cleaned your room last night. We haven't had a night housekeeper on staff for over a week." The narrator stared at him, uncomforted. "The woman who worked the night shift," the clerk continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She just stopped showing up last week. Completely vanished. We've been having to clean the rooms ourselves during the day." A sickening, cold realization washed over the narrator. Did she take her master keys when she disappeared? He asked. The clerk slowly nodded. "Yes, we haven't been able to get them back." The narrator walked out of the hotel and never looked back. The implications were horrifying to dwell on. The woman at the desk had lied to him, and the missing housekeeper, armed with a master key to every single door in the building, had never left the hotel. She was living in the walls. She was hiding in the closets, and she was standing outside his door in the dead of night, pressing her hands against the wood, listening to him breathe. Our final story flips the perspective. We've heard the nightmares of the guests, but what about the people who work in these massive, liminal spaces? What happens when the terror comes for the staff? A narrator was a house person, a hybrid role combining maintenance and housekeeping. He knew the inner workings of his hotel like the back of his hand. He knew the quiet hours, the hidden supply closets, and the strange acoustics of an empty building. It was the dead heat of summer, 2023. A stagnant, agonizingly slow Wednesday night. The hotel was virtually empty. He was working the graveyard shift with a newly hired front desk clerk named Brianna. With no check-in scheduled, they spent the early hours chatting at the desk, killing time. Eventually, a guest requested pool towels. The narrator grabbed his master key and headed down the long, echoing corridor to the indoor pool area. If you've ever been in an indoor hotel pool at night, you know the atmosphere. The heavy smell of chlorine burns your nose. Like The air is thick, humid, and oppressive, and the acoustics are incredibly sharp. Every sound bounces violently off the tiled walls and the glassy surface of the water. He unlocked the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. The pool area was completely deserted. The water was perfectly still, a flat mirror reflecting the dim emergency lights. He walked over to the small storage closet in the corner to gather fresh towels. He opened the closet, bending down to grab a stack of white linen. Splash. The sound was massive, violent, and deafening. It echoed off the tiles like a gunshot. The narrator violently jumped, dropping the entire stack of towels onto the wet floor. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, sprinting out of the closet and scanning the pool area. The surface of the water was chaotic, rolling with heavy, turbulent ripples, and bobbing right in the dead center of the pool, rocking violently back and forth, was a heavy red and white plastic lifesaver ring. It hadn't just fallen. It had been hurled with massive force directly into the center of the water. But the room was entirely empty. There were no wet footprints on the tile. The doors were locked. No one was hiding in the corners. A deep, primal unease settled in his stomach. He quickly grabbed a skimmer pole, fished the heavy ring out of the water, dumped the fresh towels on the rack, and practically ran back to the safety of the front desk. He casually asked Brianna if anyone had walked past her toward the pool. She shook her head. Right. No one had moved. Not wanting to sound insane to the new hire, he kept the terrifying incident to himself. But the night was far from over. At 30 p.m., the maintenance printer spit out a ticket. Room 324 on the third floor had a malfunctioning toilet. Brianna confirmed the room was vacant. The guest wasn't arriving until Friday. He grabbed his tool belt and headed up to the third floor. He swiped his master key and pushed open the door to room 324. The layout was standard, a short entryway with the bathroom immediately to the right, and the main sleeping area, with 2 beds further back to the left. He walked straight into the dark bathroom, flicking on the harsh vanity light, and knelt beside the porcelain egg. He lifted the heavy lid, setting it on the floor, and began adjusting the internal valves. He was deep in his work when the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. It wasn't a subtle change. It was an instant, shocking plunge in temperature. A wall of freezing, icy air descended upon him, so cold it physically hurt his skin. Every single hair on his arms and the back of his neck stood straight up. His breath hitched. It was the dead of summer. The hotel corridors were sweltering. There was absolutely no logical reason for a sudden, Arctic blast of air in a sealed room. He froze, his hands still submerged in the toilet tank water. He slowly turned his head, looking out the bathroom door toward the main bedroom, searching for an open vent or a blasted AC unit. The exact second he had the thought, the freezing pressure vanished. The heavy, warm summer air slammed back into the room. He quickly stood up and walked over to the digital thermostat on the bedroom wall. It read a perfectly normal 68 degrees. The memory of the heavy lifesaver crashing into the empty pool flashed in his mind. The hotel was beginning to feel hostile. Desperate to finish the job and get back to the illuminated lobby, he rushed back into the bathroom. He aggressively adjusted the flapper valve. The toilet groaned, and the water began to loudly flush, swirling down the bowl before the tank began to refill. He let out a heavy sigh of relief, watching the water line rise. And then, over the loud, rushing sound of the plumbing, a noise echoed from the bedroom behind him. Thump. It was a heavy, dense sound, like a massive weight being dropped directly onto the carpeted floor. The narrator froze in place. His hands gripped the edge of the porcelain egg. The paralyzing, freezing cold returned, washing over him like a tidal wave of ice. His heart began to hammer against his ribs so violently, it felt like it was trying to escape his chest. He slowly, agonizingly, placed the heavy ceramic lid back onto the toilet tank. He took a deep breath, stepping out of the small bathroom and turning his head to look into the dim, shadow-filled bedroom. His eyes were immediately drawn to the nightstand nestled between the two beds. The heavy plastic hotel phone had been knocked off its base. The receiver was dangling by its coiled cord, swaying gently back and forth in the dead air. But the phone wasn't what stopped his heart. He looked past the nightstand into the deep, dark corner of the room, right next to the far bed. Standing perfectly still, crammed into the shadows, was a figure. It was impossibly tall. The narrator couldn't pull his eyes away, his lungs completely forgetting how to breathe. As he stared, his mind struggled to comprehend what he was looking at night. It wasn't a person. It had the shape of a human, but it possessed absolutely zero features. It was a solid, three-dimensional void of pure, impenetrable blackness. It absorbed the dim light from the hallway. It looked like a character silhouette carved out of the very fabric of the room. It made absolutely no sound. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, towering over the bed, radiating an aura of pure, paralyzing dread. The narrator was trapped in the doorway, his body refusing to obey his commands to run. And then, the entity moved. It wasn't a step toward him. It was a subtle, disjointed shifting of a massive black limb. A twitch in the darkness. That microscopic movement shattered the spell. The narrator exploded into motion. He didn't scream. He simply pivoted, lunged for the heavy main door, and yanked it open with such violent, panicked force that the heavy would almost smashed into his own face. He practically flew into the hallway, slamming the door shut on the void in the corner, and sprinted down the corridor, like a man running from the devil himself. He didn't take the elevator. He threw himself down the stairwell, bursting into the lobby where Brianna was sitting peacefully at the desk. He didn't explain. He couldn't form the words. He simply clocked out, grabbed his keys, told her he was leaving, and walked out into the humid summer night. He sat in his car for a long time, the engine idling, staring up at the dark windows of the third floor. He tried to rationalize it. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the street lamps, a hallucination born of exhaustion. But he knew the truth. He felt the freezing air. He heard the heavy splash in the empty pool. And he saw the void standing in the corner of room 324. He never saw it again, but he knows, with absolute certainty, that when you check into a hotel room, you are never truly alone. Thank you for listening tonight. The next time you find yourself sliding a keycard into a heavy wooden door at the end of a long, quiet hallway, take a moment to check the locks, check the closets, and if you hear a soft, sliding sound in the dead of night, do not look under the door. Would you like to hear more stories of spaces that harbor dark secrets, or perhaps delve into mysteries from the deep, unforgiving wilderness next? Stay safe out there.